So this is a whole series of events. So we will have several webinars on this topic, one per month over the next year. And these are our next upcoming ones that we hope you'll be able to join us for, or invite colleagues, because it is open to non-members and members alike. We will also have a poll at the end of this this webinar, to see if we would like to do a part 2 on it. So please be sure to participate in that poll. I also want to let everyone know that we do have an Iaed mentorship group. And for next year's Iaed mentors, the application is opening on June 1st. And the mentee application is opening on August 1st. And this is for the Inclusion, Access, Equity, and Diversity Mentorship Group. If you're interested in that and being a mentor or a mentee, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address will be included at the end of this, and I will also put it in the chat. Also, we have some other webinar series that can be found on our website. We hope that you'll check that out and look at our other webinars offered. With that, I'm going to hand it over today to our moderator, William Sprankles, and William has served for 20 years in public education as a teacher, high school principal, and executive director. He currently serves teachers and students for Butler Tech Schools in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I did want to give him a plug that he has recently received his doctorate. So congratulations, William. And thank you so much to all of our moderators and panelists. I'm so excited today for our webinar, and I will hand it over to you, William.
Yeah, thank you. Want to begin by thanking ACTE for leaning into courageous opportunities for teachers and leaning into courageous opportunities for young people and stakeholders just in the various educational spaces. These are super important conversations. And with that in mind, I want to take the first 2 minutes to allow me to proudly introduce a remarkable panel of educators and thought leaders around the country. These people have some of the best energy that you could possibly be in shared spaces with. Even on Zoom spaces, their energy is contagious, which is difficult, right? Because they're moving in and out of these 2-inch squares, but they're doing it so thoughtfully. So with that in mind, Ms. Angel Malone, if you want to wave, I'll briefly introduce you so that the participants can hear and know who you are. Angel proudly serves as the director of the Office of Career and Technical Education with South Carolina's Department of Education. She's passionate about her work for children in South Carolina, and she believes that a great education is the expectation, not the exception. I'm gonna say it one more time for him, Angel. You believe it is the expectation, not the exception. So thank you for joining us and repping South Carolina today, Ms. Angel. Then this next gentleman, if you can wave, hands up, Sir Dr. Baron Davis, you can wave so the audience knows who you are, sir. Thank you. Currently is the superintendent of Richland School District 2 in Columbia, South Carolina. Dr. Davis is the first Black superintendent in the district's 90-year-plus history. Congratulations on such a huge achievement, sir. Discovering his passion and purpose early, Dr. Davis has been a trailblazer for public ed over the last 2 decades. His dedication to dismantling historical and current policies and practices that create structures and conditions of inequity and inequality in education has led to the adoption of a school board's equity policy that commits to providing resources for student success and employing a high quality, diverse staff. Dr. Davis, welcome to the space today. Super excited to have your expertise alongside Miss Angel Malone. And then I'd like to introduce a dear friend of mine who I've been in education with for at least 20 years and has showed me so many things along his way of expertise, Mr. Elgin Card, if you can wave, sir. Elgin's in his first year in a brand new position for Lakota School District in his role as the Senior Director of Outreach for Diversity and Inclusion. He spent the previous 8 years as the high school principal of Lakota West, and he spent 14 years at all levels of administration in both the Lakota and Princeton school districts, which are 2 of the most diverse school districts in the state of Ohio. So welcome, Mr. Card. Excited to have your expertise, and on a personal level, excited to have your brotherhood in this space today. So thank you for being here, sir. Proudly one of my colleagues from Butler Tech Schools. I'm super excited to announce Miss Tiffany Jones. If you can wave, Miss Tiffany, thank you. Tiffany is currently a business instructor in Middletown City Schools on behalf of Butler Tech. So she works for Butler Tech in Middletown, and she is newly appointed as the recruitment coordinator for all of Butler Tech Schools. That's a new promotion and a new opportunity she has earned to recruit all students into career technical education courses beginning this summer. So congrats on that new role, Ms. Tiffany. And best for last, always, Ms. Ramos. If you can wave so the participants can recognize your face. Ms. Sylvia Ramos currently serves as the Senior Director of Programs for NAEP, which is the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity. For over 20 years, she's been a transformative equity strategist, partnering with educational, community, and nonprofit orgs to assist them in achieving systemic equity and thereby creating more equitable outcomes. In the spirit of keeping it real simple for all five of you, all of you are diehard advocates around race and equity and best practices for teachers and youth. And so I just want to thank you for making time out of your busy day and your schedules for providing just good collegial space to dialogue with educators around the country. And how we're going to roll today is we have about 5 to 7 questions. Each panelist is going to lead a different question. And then each panelist is going to start filling in sub-questions and gaps and lead with affirmations and assets about what is working and what isn't working. And as a soft reminder to the participants, today's webinar is about racism, classism, and sexism, and how those terms need to be navigated when they are unconscious and conscious as they take shape in all classrooms, but in particular, career technical education, school districts and classrooms. So it's a broad topic, but some laser sharp focused opportunities. And with that in mind, we're gonna jump in. So Miss Angel and Dr. Davis, we're gonna lead with you two chasing the first question. I'll read it and you guys can jump right in. First question, or the first dialogue, is around this. How often do you personally experience conscious or unconscious isms in your work? And how do you address it to actually remove those isms when you identify them? So Ms. Angel, if you want to lead, Dr. Davis can follow you. Go for it.
So I think that happens on a daily basis, right? And that's funny that Dr. Barron and I are doing the same questions because of being the first African-American in South Carolina as a CTE director and one of very few females. I get that approach of application of isms and schisms to everything that I do. In addition to that, just throughout my educational career, being a younger lady, so ageism as well, in the field and having to lead, there are a lot of times that people will think because you are a woman that you're soft or you can't lead, or if you're young, you don't have enough experience as anyone else, being the youngest on my team, to lead. But then also as a African-American coming into the space, sometimes because the majority focus is predominantly white, what happens is that it's almost like you're learning to ride a bike in the midst of cars that are driving. You have to learn how to navigate in between that without other people considering where you are. And so that's how I've experienced that. But how I navigate that is to bring us to a common ground. So what do we have in common? What's the common issue? Or what can we do together? What's that commonality that's there? And then we can set a goal from there. Because when I can show you how we are alike, then and we can appreciate the differences in a different way.
Thank you for leading out the gates. Dr. Davis, go ahead, sir.
I want to take a quick moment to say a shout out to all the panelists that are on this call, and William, again, thank you all for including Richland too in this conversation. I also want to shout out one of my board members that's jumped on, Miss Amelia Mackey. I have some supportive board members, and so she's taking time out of her busy day to support her superintendent. I love her for that. So thank you for doing that. I remember when I was first an assistant administrator at one of our high schools here in the school district, and the conversation centered around, this was like 1999, 2000, I was just starting out, and there were very few superintendent administrators of color at this particular high school, at Spring Valley High School at the time, and there was a lot of conversations about my qualifications to serve as an assistant administrator. I wasn't an assistant principal, I was just an assistant administrator. And people questioned whether or not I had the actual credentials and the qualifications to be to serve in this role. Fast forward, I became an assistant principal and things of that. But when I became an assistant principal, I never forget I was standing in the hallway, and I had on a shirt and tie, and I used to wear suspenders and all this good stuff, and I had my keys and my radio, and someone walked up to me and asked me, was I the custodian? And I remember thinking, I don't degrade our custodial staff because they do such a phenomenal job, but I don't recall any custodians that I've ever seen in a high school wearing a shirt and tie, that would be mistaken, or a person wearing a shirt and tie would be mistaken for a custodian at that time. And so those are some of the microaggression types of things that have always happened, but at that time we didn't classify those things as microaggression. Fast forward to 2012, I left the district in 2006, and I came back and experienced this whole notion about whether or not I actually understood the culture of the school that I was returning back to be the principal of, which is where I started my career. And it led to a firestorm of media coverage and comments in the paper about being named the first African-American principal of that high school. We had already had a first African-American high school principal in the school district, but this particular high school had never had an African-American principal, and was the oldest of the high schools in the district and the flagship high school of our district at the time. So there was a lot of concerns, and it was code words like, he doesn't understand the culture of the school, and the school was predominantly African-American. So I was a little concerned that I didn't understand the culture of the school. And then now, of course, as superintendent, there are a lot of isms that you have to deal with, and particularly as an African-American male, the isms that I'm particularly speaking of is the isms of racism, but as directly about how people perceive you as a man of color or African-American male. Are you intellectually capable of handling this type of a responsibility and the challenges that come along with it? I call it a familiarity with Black leadership. There seems to be an over familiarity with Black leadership. So some of the things that I have observed from my previous predecessors that I have to experience, the comfort, the casualness of which they approach the leadership, is different from of how they approach the leadership when the leadership was held by a white male or a white female. It was way more formal. But with me, it's very informal in a sense. I liken it to, if you remember, the governor of Arizona, who had the audacity and the nerve to point her finger in the president of the United States' face when he got off the plane, almost in a form of chastisement. That was a familiarity with Black leadership on a prime example of how, as a man of color, you have to deal with that type of perception sometimes about who you are. So how do I deal with it? I continue to put in structures and have conversations around race, around gender, around ability, and we try to then break down those barriers. We continue to identify systemic practices, perceptions, microaggressions. We bring those things to people's attention in the hopes and the ideas that we'll begin to recognize some of those implicit practices that they may already have, or even some of the ones that are right out there for you, for anyone to experience, and then start having real conversations about how do we create a space that is socially and emotionally healthy for all individuals in our school districts, including our adults and our employees, as well as our children.
So in the initial frames, Angel and Baron, there's a couple of like what I'm hearing and what I'm noticing is, Angel, there was this concept you talked about identifying common ground.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that loud and clear in your articulation, right? And then, Baron, I heard you in your frame of many things talk about creating safe systems and safe structures to promote dialogue that's going to yield courageous conversation. But you also talked about a lot of the isms and how they surface in so many different places and spaces. But what you and Angel both had in common was you talked about both of you being the first person of color or African-American in your unique leadership positions. I'm wondering if we can work to bring that question to a close by the following sub-question. What advice do you have, can we provide for first-year teachers that might be the first teacher of color in their district, that might be the first teacher of color in a career tech center? And how do they navigate the isms if they're not in a position of leadership that might be titled assistant principal or director? What do they do so that they can navigate that culture the right way? Do you have any immediate thoughts that we can work to bring that question to a close? And then Mr. Card, you'll be up next. Go ahead.
So I'm going to say, if you are a new teacher that's a teacher of color and you're the first in that particular area, the first thing I want to do is release you from all of the responsibility, because as African Americans, as Black and brown people, sometimes we carry that responsibility and we can refrain from being our authentic self because we feel like we may mess it up for someone coming behind us. I want to free you to be yourself, number one.
Clear.
Number two, I want to make sure that, yes, you do find things that are common so you can come to some reasoning with people who are different from you and appreciate the different cultures. But also, as Baron talked about, don't be afraid to create a safe place. And a part of that safe place is to challenge when people say something that is offensive or have an action or apply to something that is offensive. You have a voice, use it. So those are the things that I think would help as you start.
Dr. Davis, I'm wondering if I can build on what Angel said and make a small pivot in real time and see if you can't coach us through this, sir. What would be your advice to a non-Black administrator? So for example, a white administrator who now has a person of color, it's the first person of color in their space. What might be coaching for that person to provide the right framing or support or language in order for that person, Angel, to not feel that weight or to have that freedom? What do you say, Dr. Davis, to that person?
That's a good pivot. I would say for that person to put on the framework of empathy and understand that here's a person that's in a space and they're the only one in that space that looks like them. So put on a frame of empathy and so that you can truly try to get some understanding. I would then couch that with the second thing, which would have gone with what Angel said, which was have courage, have the courage to show empathy publicly for someone, not privately, not when they come to your office and they're concerned, but have the courage to show the empathy publicly for the individual. And thirdly, try to then work to create conditions of support and encouragement to create so that person doesn't remain the only one for an extended period of time, that they're not the for lack of better words, the token person that you can say, I check the box. Don't allow them to be a check the box individual, but be a person that you're trying to build the diversity. And the fourth thing is, understand why this is purposeful. Because if you're in a school system, you're trying to expose your children and your students to diverse thoughts, diverse perspectives, diverse cultures, diverse beliefs, principles, and things of that nature in order to help them be more diverse and global citizens.
Yeah, so let's bring this to a close, because what I heard was moving from common ground and systems and structures to now having a mindset, Angel, of being free and not carrying the weight. Simultaneously, if there's, for example, Dr. Davis, maybe a white administrator in the role who has the responsibility of supporting a new teacher of color in their particular space to work on things like public empathy, a continuum of supports, to really understand as a white person what tokenism is and how we have to wrestle with that so that we don't place that responsibility on folks of color. And really understand the long range investment and importance of diversity. So thank you for the first frame. Thank you for the first round of dialogue, and for all the participants that are listening. Only one of those questions were scripted. The rest of those questions, they did not have these answers made up, which is what makes me feel so privileged to be in this space. Is you guys are really freestyling critical conversation in real time, which is important for educators to be able to do. I want to get into how I'm going to transition to you, Mr. Card. Is Dr. Davis, you were talking about all these isms, microaggressions, and that's one form of an ism. And the question is for you, Mr. Card, for you to lead with, is why is it important for individuals in the classroom, i.e. teachers, to accept responsibility for actions that contribute to bias? Does accepting ownership over your actions help address the problem, or does it make it worse if I talk about that I have this problem?
I think it takes me to thinking about quote that's on my wall here by my Angel Malone. Do the best you can. I'm paraphrasing. Do the best you can so you know better. When you know better, do better. And I think what I'm finding out in some of my experiences and this role and as a principal is many of our teachers don't know. So I think it's important that we educate them on that and have those tough conversations. And as the panelists before me said, sometimes they don't understand that you have to listen to that. You have to be empathetic to where they're at. And as you have empathy for that and understand somebody else's experiences, you can understand where you're at and move forward. And we talked about, Dr. Davis talked about microaggressions, and I just sent a list of those to our executive team in the district and all our principals, administrators, and that's a really good conversation around that, because I was very, in the work we're doing here, you have to make sure that you're not, I'm not preaching to you, I'm not pointing fingers at you, because I've done some of those things. And there's times I still do some of those things, but I also have to check myself, look in the mirror and understand I need to be empathetic for other people. As an African-American male, and then Dr. Davis and Miss Angel, y'all was preaching, because I could, I'm the first Black high school principal in this district. I'm the first Black person in a lot of things I've done. So I understand where you guys are coming from with that. And as far as Angel saying, I always put it on myself to make sure I did well so the next person gets a chance. And so I think that is something to do. But I think you have to have the conversation, William. I'm not sure if it makes it worse. I think I've been very adamant with my groups I have here with kids in the schools that they need to speak out when they see something wrong, but they need to do it in a proper manner. And that is key, because sometimes it can get worse if it's not handled in a proper way. And then trying to teach kids to do that with adults is hard. And then getting your teachers to understand kids have a lot of great things to say. Teachers sometimes can be, this is my class, here's how we're doing it, and I don't want to hear it. And that's not where we're at anymore. So I think having those tough conversations with them, people pointing those things out, can help in that manner. But I'll be honest, this work is hard. This work is uncomfortable. And people need to understand that, and understand that we're doing it for the betterment of all our kids. It's not about us, it's about all our kids. And that's key.
Yeah, Elgin, so you raised this interesting concept that every human being, in particular every educator, I imagine, wrestles with, which is our own journey of self-awareness, right? Like, I recall the times in my career I was a third-year teacher, or I was a second-year administrator. I allowed myself to come into conflict with the perception I was having about a student or a group of students. And what happens when you, as the educator, realize that you're now consciously in conflict with the perception that you don't want to act on, but you're having it? And the first thing that I would name, and then Sylvia, I'd love for you to go next, followed by Tiffany, followed by Angel, talking about your own journey towards becoming conscious, critically conscious, and self-aware. Is the first thing I would say, though, is every human being is wrestling in this journey. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing that I would say is the journey never ends. Yeah. There is no space of accomplishment or arrival where you get to the finish line in thinking that you don't have to work on checking your own biases every single day. And so, Sylvia, I'm wondering if you can't take over and just talk about what's been your journey toward self-awareness and how you deal with your own isms that you are wrestling with. Like, just talk for the participants to hear your narrative around this for a couple minutes. And then Tiffany, you can go, followed by Miss Angel.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And thank you again for inviting me to this important conversation. So I appreciate your question because I think that you named so many important things, right? So much about equity, I think people believe is really about the external work, the work that other people need to do. And I think sometimes we forget, and I use the collective we, because there's also the misconception that to be is to know or be conscious. And here's what I mean by that. So I identify as an Afro-Indigenous Peruvian who grew up in the South. I grew up in South Florida. And you talk about the journey, right, of becoming conscious. And that has been and continues to be a lifelong journey, right? So for me, I was read or people interpreted me to be biracial, right? So there was no recognition for the diaspora, right? And that required that I spend a lot of time in my own investigating of my history, of why it is that there were a lot of people that didn't understand that Black folks existed, again, in the diaspora in South America and Central America and all over the world, right? And what that did for me is it really gave me a place from which to empathize around what that journey looks like. To recognize that all of us in some way are dealing with ways that we identified that were either imposed on us or that we were just told this is who you are, what you are, don't question it. And so the journey of quite frankly, coming to understand myself for myself has been a lifelong journey. And it's also constantly a journey where I recognize that I have to think critically about all aspects of how I identify in terms of my ability, in terms of gender, in terms of immigration status, right? I was undocumented growing up and became documented later on. And so all of these different layers of my identity have constantly required me to think about what that means in terms of how we identify and how that can also be a part of the tools that I lean on to think about how do I bring people along with me, even when we don't share same identities, right? How do I get them to understand that it really is critical for us to understand our own journey before we can really develop an appreciation for other people's differences and other people's journeys.
Something you said, Tiffany, before you follow her was, I don't know if you remember the exact frame you just laid out here, but you talked about all of us are experiencing this. In your share out, Sylvia, you just talked about every human is experiencing the reflection and the wrestling of their identity. And I appreciate that statement because it serves as a vehicle to establish some common ground when we all accept we're at wrestling, we're in a space of reflection with what our identity is on a regular basis. So thank you for that frame. Ms. Tiffany Jones, if you'd love to fill in, take it away.
Yeah, so my journey, going back to when I was in school, right? Biracial, I am Black and white. So in growing up, I either saw a part of myself in my teachers or I did not. And so what I noticed about my behavior in the classroom is if I felt connected, if I felt close to the teacher or included in the classroom, I did really well. I engaged, I practiced, I did everything for that course and that teacher. if I did not see myself or feel included in that classroom, I pushed back quite a bit. And so now, as a biracial teacher, I think it's important in my own reflection and having this critical conscious awareness about your practices, because it's in our own creation of our classroom management, our policies and procedures, that in not seeing myself, I noticed that it's a struggle for finding yourself through power. So for walking into a classroom, a teacher is this person of authority. They're the person that's controlling these grades and these even minor daily privileges in the classroom.
Mm.
And if the student connects to you or they see themselves in you, then the student may not question or challenge your control.
Wow.
But if a student does not see themselves in you or see why they're here or how they're included, it's in those practices that we start to have this power struggle. And I feel that it's important for us to understand this as teachers, that we control this atmosphere. And do we really understand that we control that same power dynamic in creating who the student is and the access they deserve in our classrooms?
But Tiffany, this is the but, right? That's not how I think about it. I'm a nice person. I treat all my students the same. Like Angel, how do we navigate critical conversations when the answer comes from a place of well-intention or good heart, but the language that is used to represent the intent conveys different meaning embedded within that answer? What happens when that's the answer?
So I'm laughing because I actually thought about a specific situation as my first years of being a principal. And I hired, as a new principal, a full TFA or Teach for America staff. And so these were predominantly white teachers coming into it, a predominantly African-American community. And not only was those teachers teaching our students, but I was teaching them. This was their first opportunity. And I'm going to tell you that in a class with all of these children who grew up in a community together, this teacher from Minnesota, she sent out an assignment to write to the Ku Klux Klan, and you had to choose a side. She gave you a side. You didn't choose. You were either in opposition or you were for it. So some of these African American children had to write as if they were for the actions of the Ku Klux Klan. One of the students, in defiance, walked, and I don't even say defiance, but challenging, walked out of the class and said, I refused to do the assignment. She was biracial. She came and told me. I went and I pulled the teacher in. The teacher wrote the student up for defiance and wanted me to discipline her. And when I called her out on it and I said, hey, you had this assignment, let's talk about it, because this is not how this is supposed to go. The student refuses to do it. You cannot grade this work. And being young, that's what I said, because I was like, how dare she? And I remember her saying, how dare you question me as a professional on what I'm doing? Well, we had to stop for a moment. And that's why I say it's on a spectrum. I think it's on a spectrum of empathy from assimilation to authenticity that you move. And we actually had a conversation, and I said, listen, you're the white teacher in this building of predominantly African-American children, and you're asking them to write to the Ku Klux Klan. She stopped for a moment. I said, imagine if it were the other way around. I saw from her point of view, so I stopped getting angry, and I saw that maybe that did seem like disrespect, so I had to use empathy there. But on the other side of that, she was able to see and appreciate, darn, I was about to give an assignment to these kids that was highly offensive. I didn't understand. I'm from a totally different culture, totally different place. That teacher, that white teacher, became my ally and was able to pull in those African-American children and build trust after we were able to have a conscious conversation that was courageous, call her out on it, and then change what happens. So I think that it takes the teaching from the leader, as well as the teacher teaching in that classroom, and building a space for you to have those courageous conversations so that you can confront when your own isms are in the place. Because at the time, while I was calling her out, I was angry and I was being a perpetrator as well.
Angel, something that you said causes me to recognize the irony of the 6 of us in these shared spaces. Right, so something I'm trying to always live in this space of courageous acknowledgement. There's irony in me being a white male facilitating a dialogue around race and equity with 5 folks that are not in the same space that I'm in. And I share that on the heels of Sylvia's reflection around wrestling with your identity. Tiffany, your reflection around seeing yourself in positions of influence or positions of power. Angel, what to do when, as a leader or a teacher, maybe there's a colleague that doesn't intend, or they do intend, but an instructional practice, behavior, or curricular strategy manifests itself in a way that creates a really tough situation. Is I'm reminded of the following: the work around race and equity for white folks is less about getting to know people of color. While that's equally important, it's just as much about wrestling with our own whiteness and understanding what critical whiteness is. I remember going through a younger part of my collegiate career and having more studies around people of color than I did understanding how the power dynamics of whiteness came to be. And only then did it have a significant shift on my frame and my lens and my thinking on how I could be more culturally relevant on a day-to-day grind. So I appreciate those 3 narratives, Sylvia and Tiffany, and the teaching frame, Angel, because something that it causes me to do is to overstate the importance of, I invite and encourage those folks that are white educators on today's call to make sure that the representation of 5 folks of color and 1 white folk in this space does not mean it's that we need to spend more time learning about folks of color. That may be true. It's equally important for us to wrestle with the evolution of critical whiteness along that journey so that we understand the comprehensive dynamic. And that gives Angel's example, Baron. I want you to kickstart this conversation on, we know that students learn better when they see themselves represented in the curriculum. How can teachers, educators, principals, coaches, curriculum directors, how do we create more inclusive environments to engage and meet the needs of all students? Like if representation matters, how do we do that through a curricular approach in career tech education? How does that happen?
I think the first thing that happens is that it happens with intentionality. It's not just a situation where we talk about we need to do it so we have to have intentionality. So I think the first thing we have to do is do an honest assessment of where we fall, what we do well, number 1, and then where we fallen short in what our goals, falling short in meeting the goal that we want to accomplish. Once we identify what we do well, we can decide how we're going to replicate those practices. So what are examples of this representation taking place in our organization? Where do we see it taking place in our different organizations? And then where it's not taking place, how do we replicate those things? And then if we need to create, or first, before we create something, we need to identify whether or not there's some sort of structure, practices, or institutional practices, barriers, whatever, that prevent us from doing what we want to do. And if those barriers exist, we really got to work to break those barriers down, dismantle those barriers before we can create a new structure that will allow us to accomplish what we want to accomplish. I just don't believe in trying to have these simultaneous practices, one that's restricts and then one that actually allows for the access of opportunities. So I want to only have the one that has the access for opportunities. And so once we do that, I think that's a good start. I also think that training, or not so much as training, but again, I'm beginning to evolve to this point where I realize we do a whole lot of PD on stuff. in schools. We are PD ourselves out in schools, right? But we're really not creating conditions that allow the stuff that we're trying to do to really take root and become part of our cultural practices, our everyday, become a part of the culture. So it's not enough just to have teachers go through, things of cultural relevant pedagogy, and you do the PD, you get the certificate, and it's over. And then there's nothing around it in the conversations about the creation of courses, the assignment of who's going to teach those courses, the support that's going to be provided to those courses, the financial resources that's going to be provided. There's nothing around that supports the cultural relevance that you just went through, the trainings you just went through. The same thing with SEL, the same thing with MTSS, whatever you want to call it. We're not putting enough support around those things that we want to become part of our culture. So once you plant a seed, in order for it to grow, you got to nurture the environment and for it to grow. And you also have to pull up the weeds that possibly choke that environment out, or that seed out. So you got to identify what those things are, and then continue to figure out how you nurture that environment so that can grow. And those are the practices you have to do, things like that you have to do. And we talked about that, I think, in the link before, right? Who are you assigning classes to? Who's in charge of curriculum in your schools and in your school districts? What conversations are you having around curriculum? Is there a diverse group of individuals that sit at the table to have those discussions, or that discussion done historically by the same group of people who had access or control of the curriculum before, or the instructional practices, I should say, because curriculum really doesn't have a big of an impact as the instructional practices that we need to use and sustain in our schools.
Sylvia, I'm wondering if you or Tiffany or Elgin can maybe chase this follow-up. In Barron's frame, there was a lot of intentional language around intentional systems, moves, decisions, and decision makers. What happens when, and I believe we have so many powerful school districts and leaders and teachers moving in the right direction, but they're like, let's not be naive. There's still pockets that are struggling to create progress in this country. What do we say to the teacher who thinks that they're the Lone Ranger right now and they can't get the support? They don't have the administrator that's tuning in to this critical conversation, and they feel like they're on an island in their district. And then maybe do they risk their job? How do I approach my superintendent? Do I call my curriculum director? I want to make a change, but I don't feel that these conditions, Dr. Davis, that you're talking about have yet been created. So what do I do when the conditions aren't ripe? What do I do? What's your advice, knowing that this can't be answered in 2 minutes, but what's your initial response to a teacher? What do we say to that teacher that's hungry for change?
So here's what I'll share. A few things. Change can happen any number of ways. And I think while I believe that in order for complete transformation to take place, you have to have the buy-in, the support, the infrastructure from decision makers. I believe that wholeheartedly.
Clear.
And I will also tell you, as someone who has worked in all of these different spaces, what I came to learn to be called organizational psychology or organizational development, about how we build these systems to have specific outcomes, I ultimately realized it's just community organizing. It is relationships. So if you are that one teacher that feels like you've been holding this down on your own, you've got to think about who are the people that you are building relationships with. Wow. How do you connect with them? Inside your school system, outside your school system, remember that there are levers all over. Parents, families, faith community. How do you build relationships to create the kind of change and to garner the kind of support that will make your work a little bit easier, or at least provide you with the kind of infrastructure that allows you to continue to move the work forward in a way that's going to have the kind of impact that we want to have with our students.
Yeah.
And William, I want to add, I think it's very important, something is if you have the opportunity to get some student voice involved in that, it would be huge. I know that it's very easy for people to not listen to me or you or whomever as an adult, but when the students that are there and they're hungry for it, and you can take that to your school board, you can take that to your superintendent or your other teachers. If you're in this for the right reason, the student voice is going to mean something to you. So I think, something I'm trying to do right now, and we're working on that, but that is a huge piece that earlier in my career, I didn't understand. I think you did that in the early part of your career. I was with you, and you're one of the ones that got me to that point and got me thinking about that. But students, if the students want it and it's a good thing and they still won't go there, then that's just there's a heart problem there with me.
Thank you, Elgin. So I'm going to make a soft pivot in our agenda. We got like 3 or 4 questions left that were pre-planned, but I'm going to jump to the final question because we're at 2:47, and Angel might tee off on this question right here. She wants to hit a grand slam because she's got a lot to say on it. I know all the folks do. Here's the question: how can CTE educators navigate negative perspectives of CTE schools or pathways for minorities or for students of color or for anyone in an affinity group that is a non-traditional affinity group? Right, so I'm going to restate that question. How can CTE schools or educators navigate negative perceptions about CTE opportunities for anyone in a non-traditional affinity group? What do we do? How do we help tell the narrative that this is the right work, this is the right opportunity? How do we navigate these spaces? Tiffany from the teacher level, Angel from the state level, Sylvia from the nonprofit sector, right? Baron, for you and Elgin from the executive leadership level. There's so many conversations to be had top to bottom. How do we chip away at this?
So first, I'm going to say you have to be deliberate and intentional in the work that you do. I think that you have to have targeted recruitment and representation for those particular areas where there may be some isms as it relates to minorities in particular CTE fields. I also believe that you have to respect where some of the history comes from, because in Black and Brown communities, especially Black communities, sometimes it wasn't the popular choice to go into career in tech ed or vocational, right? Because of the systemic racism that is tied to some of those particular fields. And so I think you have to understand that historical knowledge or learn to open yourself to learn more about that. But I also believe it has to be deliberate, has to be intentional. There has to be representation. And from a state level, what we're trying to do is you have to create systemic changes in policy. So no matter who is in that position, whether it's the first African-American female, a white male, or whomever, the results is a well-oiled machine because of policy that mitigates that implicit or unconscious bias.
Whoever'd like to follow her, and when the time is right, at some point, Baron, when you decide to weave into the conversation, Angel talked about the systemic racism surrounding career tech. I know in our initial collaboration a couple of weeks ago, you talked about that. I'm wondering, given we only have a couple minutes, if you can weave it into the conversation thoughtfully in a brief way.
Yeah, very quickly. I believe that the CTE pathways, one of the problems with it is when we speak of it, we usually pair it with this whole notion that everyone doesn't have to go to college. And so CTE kind of came this offset of everyone doesn't have to go to college, so we're going to make you career ready. And so here are these classes that would make you career ready. And as Angel was stating, in years past, a lot of African Americans, many African American students were relegated to those types of courses, labor type of classes. We did brick and masonry. We did things like construction. We did things like, barbering and cosmetology. It became these labor or service things. Now CTE has evolved so much and is so much more technical to that side of it now that it does require a higher level of acumen when it comes to some of these courses, but that stigma is still there. And what we have to do and understand, though, is on the backside of this, the CTE push that we have to address is when students are entering into CTE classes or they don't go on to college, what happens then? They're going to find it more challenging and difficult to be promoted in their profession, and so they're going to have the skills to do the work. They're going to be educated enough to do the work, but will they get the opportunity to be for the promotions? Will they get an opportunity to become the executives? Because they now don't have the college degree that was going to be required. And that's going to be a barrier that many that are the people who are in charge of making that decision on who's going to be promoted is going to look at. They're going to promote the person with the highest level of degree in those positions. And we saw this happen during the crisis of the recession back in 2008 and 2009, as companies were hiring people back into the workforce. The first set of people they were hiring were the individuals who had the 4-year college degrees. So all the people who had all the CTE experience prior to that, they were hiring their supervisors back to be the people first because they had the college degree and they were getting a higher level of a higher educated level of employee for a lower wage. So we have to be kind of critical and careful with that as we're promoting CTE, because I think it's a great pathway and a viable pathway and an awesome pathway. And so one of the things we do here in our district is our responsibility is to provide you with the highest possible level. That's what we want of an educational experience we can give you, and let you decide where you want to go. We're not going to start cherry picking kids and say, you are going to do this, you should do that. Here, this is the expectation for your educational experience. Now, whatever you decide to do, you are prepared for 2-year college, the workforce, the military, or college. It doesn't matter, you're prepared for that. That's the goal for us as educators, what we need to do. And I think that will remove some of the stigma from CTE.
Yeah, so at the core of the tail end of your response, what I heard in my words, sir, was really providing the highest levels of access and equity as a mindset because of the systems and the structures, and letting young people and families arrive at their own decisions, just leveraging and hinging on ACTE's frame today around access and around equity being a critical driver for that push. Something that I want to acknowledge that came up in the chat room. I don't know that we have the time to unpack it today because I believe the name is Adrian Graham, dropped a question that I have never heard before. And it is about what are the thoughts of career tech education reversing the impact of the school to prison pipeline. And I just want to acknowledge the question and just let it sit in the space, Ms. Graham. And allow my counterparts at ACTE to hear that question, because I believe that could be a critical conversation to explore. I believe that could be a critical conversation to explore at a future webinar, just as powerful as today's was. In the spirit of, we talked about working on ourselves, right? I'd like to end today by asking each of the panelists to do the following. What are you learning today? Not what did you contribute into the space as a thought leader, not what did you bring to the dialogue today as perhaps an expert from your field, but what is just one simple thing you learned today from your fellow panelists or from a variety of dialogues that happened today. And if we can keep that very, very brief to almost 1 or 2 sentences each, it would help us navigate the call and bring it to an organized close. But I'd like to model the best practice of working on ourselves at all times. And whoever would like to lead, we'll just organically let that flow. Sylvia, I see your head nodding. if you're ready, you can lead. If not, someone else can gladly lead. But what did you learn today?
I think for me, I walk away with an affirmation around the need to stay compassionate with myself and others, to simultaneously hold myself and others accountable so that we can do better. And to remember that because we are all impacted by these systems, that I must continue to stay engaged in my own work around my own consciousness so that I understand what are the ways in which I can become complicit in systems of oppression.
Sylvia, thank you for the powerful reflection. Miss Tiffany or Miss Angel, if either of you would like to go next, just one thing that you learned today that you're wrestling with in your own conscious right now.
Yeah, Angel and Sylvia talked a lot about being intentional and deliberate about these practices and coming from all areas of the views that we've had today. But it's in doing intentionality and being deliberative makes things transparent and open for all students, all programs to be all inclusive. And that's what I'm taking away today.
Thank you, Miss Tiffany. Let's go Angel and then Baron, and we'll finish with Elgin.
So I'm learning that the responsibility I have is what I journaled this morning. I choose to be kind. I choose to be courageous. I choose to have empathy with myself and with others. And I understand that I am still becoming. And I think if we understand that it's a journey, we're not going to reach this pivotal point, just like say a more perfect union. If we have that mindset as we talk about unconscious bias and mitigating it, we'll get somewhere.
I learned that there are educational leaders and educational professionals on this call who believe in the extraordinary power of authenticity. I believe that there are people who support you in your efforts to be courageous so that you can practice your authenticity, because you need that. You got to be courageous to practice authenticity. And I'll share this with what I sent you earlier. I've confirmed that there are other people who seek to be promisingly disruptive. And we have a coalition and a group of people who want to be promisingly disruptive.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Elgin, close this out, sir.
A couple quick things. I think Dr. Davis's thing about how we talk to kids about the CET classes kind of hit me when we talked about our meeting the other day. It's making me think how I'm going to talk to kids when I have those conversations. And really, the thing for me is seeing 4 other powerful people of color on this call, having these conversations. I don't get to do that very often where I'm at, and it just makes me feel good that I know that people are out there along with the fight and trying to make things better for kids.
Thank you, Elgin. In the spirit of participating in the activity too is, for me, I think what I'm learning today is you're only as strong as the village that you surround yourself with in this work, right? You can't do this work by yourself. And the beauty of the pandemic, or the beauty of technology through the pandemic, is prior to this, I would have never, like 12 months ago, I would have not been on a Zoom with Angel and Sylvia and Baron. I would have never, in fact, we may have never discovered each other, right? I know Tiffany and I know Elgin, but by expanding my village, it is expanding the ability to be a learner in this space. And I'm learning that in the journey of understanding critical whiteness, it's super important to be deliberate and intentional in naming that's part of my journey, to understand how to be an active disruptor in systemic racism and all the systemic isms, right? This is the work of white folks. This is the responsibility of white folks to dismantle these types of structures and systems that can't be work that is placed on folks of color or folks from other affinity groups any longer. So I thank you guys for investing in my leadership in the last 30 days. I thank you for volunteering your time on behalf of ACTE as thought leaders and experts and career technical educators that are passionate for all youth. And I hope that you 5 will come back and join join again in the early fall and maybe expand this webinar to having an additional topic on how we can just dig in deeper. So you see a poll that is auto-generated around, would you be interested in a part 2 webinar on confronting isms in the classroom? And we would love if you would complete that poll prior to exiting. On behalf of ACTE, on behalf of all the panelists, we thank you. Deep appreciation and deep respect for any educator that came to this space today with the spirit of growing and getting better for young people. Thank you deeply. Ms. Megan from ACTE, I'll allow you to come back on and facilitate or leave the room open if the poll needs to stay open before you close out the space.
Thank you so much, William. And to our panelists, we are eternally grateful for these important conversations, for your time, your expertise, and your efforts. Hopefully we will be doing a part 2 series this fall. And, I hope we all just leave here being a little more reflective and a little more self-aware, and we can all make a difference. So thank you all for your time and efforts, particularly all the panelists. It was just an exceptional panel.